You are standing in the back room of a Manhattan tenement on Eldridge Street, 1894. The ceiling is low. The lamp burns tallow, not oil. 3 men sit at a wooden table that has been in this building since before the Civil War. And on that table, there are no contracts, no bank ledgers, no signatures. What is on that table is a small leather pouch, a tin of coarse salt, and folded inside each man's coat pocket, more cash than most Americans would see in a year. The Hasidic rabbis of the Lower East Side did not build their merchant networks inside a bank. They built them inside a system so old it predates the United States by 2,000 years, and they built it for $2. In 1907, J. Pierpont Morgan made sure no one outside that room would ever learn it. After the last file I published on the coin placement method, many of you wrote asking the same question. You asked where the salt fits into all of this. You asked because somewhere in the back of your memory, maybe something your grandmother did, maybe something you saw in a market in Kingston or Lagos or Cebu, you already half knew the answer. This file is going to give you the rest of it. In 1898, the Lower East Side of Manhattan was the most densely populated square mile in the recorded history of the world. The New York Tenement House Department documented 312 Jewish merchant households operating commercial enterprises on that stretch of land between Rivington and Delancey, between Essex and Orchard. Of those 312 documented merchants, 287 had no bank account, not one. They moved $4.8 million in commerce that year, verifiable in the Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, cross-referenced against the Ellis Island Commercial Trade Registers of 1897 through 1901, using a method that does not appear in a single American economics textbook published before 1970. The other 25 merchants, the ones who did use banks, by 1907 they had lost almost everything in the panic. The 287 who did not, they kept their wealth intact. That is not a coincidence. That is a system. The Columbia archives contain the original Tenement Inspector Field reports from 1903. I have read these documents with my own eyes, sitting in a climate-controlled reading room on 116th Street with cotton gloves on my hands, because these papers are that fragile. The inspectors who were sent into these buildings were not looking for commerce. They were looking for overcrowding violations. But what they documented, incidentally, almost accidentally, is a parallel economy so disciplined, so internally coherent, that one inspector wrote in his personal notation, not in the official report, in the margin. These men keep their money in a way I cannot explain. No receipts, no ledgers visible, and yet they always have it. The practice these merchants were using had roots in shtetls spread across Eastern Europe: Galicia, Vilna, Lublin, Lodz, Bialystok, the small towns of what was then the Russian Pale of Settlement. When families arrived at Ellis Island, and between 1880 and 1910, 1.4 million Eastern European Jews arrived through that port, they did not arrive knowing nothing. They arrived carrying a portable infrastructure. It had no weight. You could not confiscate it at the border. It lived inside a set of practices, weekly, physical, repetitive, that had been transmitted from rabbi to merchant to son in exactly the same form for longer than the United States had existed as a country. I sat in the basement of the Eldridge Street Synagogue last spring with the archivist, and she pulled out a ledger I had been trying to access for 2 years. It was not catalogued. It was stored in a wooden box behind a shelf of prayer books, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff with age. Inside were the household accounts of 7 merchant families operating between Orchard Street and Hester Street from 1891 to 1919. Column after column of numbers, all in Yiddish script, all balanced. But what caught my attention was not the numbers. It was a notation that appeared at the start of every single week's accounting, the same 4 Hebrew words, written in the same hand, repeated 1,456 times across 28 years. The archivist translated it for me. It means, salt holds what paper cannot. That is not a folk saying. That is an operational instruction. Now I want you to understand exactly what was happening in 1907, because this is the part that most people get wrong. J. Pierpont Morgan was not simply a banker. By 1907, he personally controlled or held significant influence over National City Bank, First National Bank, the New York Central Railroad, U.S. Steel, International Harvester, and General Electric. His library, the private one, at 36th Street and Madison Avenue, the one that is now a museum you can walk into, was the actual center of American financial decision-making in a way that no building in Washington was. In October of 1907, a banking panic swept New York. Banks were failing, the stock exchange was collapsing, and Morgan did something that no private citizen had done before or has done since. He personally orchestrated the rescue of the American financial system. He summoned the heads of every major bank to his library, locked the doors, and told them what they were going to do. He stopped the panic of 1907. They called him a hero. What they did not tell you is what he said before the doors were locked. I have read the internal correspondence that preceded those meetings. It is housed partly in the Pierpont Morgan Library archives and partly in a collection at the New York Historical Society that is technically available to researchers but has never been cited in a mainstream financial history. In one letter, written to his personal secretary in September of 1907, 2 weeks before the panic broke, Morgan wrote words that I am going to read to you precisely. These foreign merchants conduct 4.8 million in untraceable commerce on the east side of this city alone. They borrow from no institution. They insure with no institution. This must end. A banking system that does not reach these men cannot hold. That is not a quote from a history book. History books do not contain that quote. I found it in a folder marked Private Correspondence, East Side Survey, 1907. It was never indexed. That sentence, "This must end," became policy within 6 years. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the infrastructure. The banking reforms that followed World War I pushed immigrant communities into bank dependency with a combination of incentives and regulatory pressure. By 1933, when Glass-Steagall was signed and the FDIC was created in 1934, the informal merchant networks of the Lower East Side had been systematically absorbed into the formal banking system. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust had already demonstrated what centralized control of a resource looks like. Morgan applied that same logic to money itself. The Gilded Age railroad barons, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Harriman, had already shown that controlling the infrastructure of movement meant controlling the economy. Morgan's insight was that controlling the infrastructure of credit meant controlling everything else. And the one thing that stood outside that infrastructure, the one merchant class that moved millions without using his banks, was the community on Eldridge Street. So he moved to include them, forcibly, through law. In 2018, a sociology dissertation completed at Princeton analyzed the commercial networks of the Lower East Side between 1890 and 1930, using digitized census records, immigration logs, and commercial tax filings. The finding, not publicized, not cited in any mainstream source I have found, was that merchant households, practicing what the dissertation called non-institutional liquidity preservation, accumulated wealth at a rate 4.2 times faster than comparable immigrant households using formal banking over the same period. 4.2 times. That is not a marginal difference. That is the difference between your grandchildren inheriting something and inheriting nothing. And the central practice associated with the highest accumulating households was a weekly physical ritual involving salt, a leather pouch, and folded currency. The dissertation identified it. It did not explain it. Because the researcher did not have the Eldridge Street ledger. I do. Here is what you do. You do this on Friday before sundown. That is the boundary. The practice is tied to the beginning of Shabbat, which in the Hebrew tradition is not a day of rest in the sentimental sense. It is the weekly reset of covenant. In Numbers 18:19, the covenant of salt is described as permanent, inviolable, beyond the reach of any human institution. In Talmudic Bava Batra 8, salt is described as the guard against decay, the thing that holds form when everything around it is dissolving. The merchants on Orchard Street were not being superstitious. They were using salt the way a ship captain uses a compass, as a tool with a specific function, calibrated and intentional. The materials cost you $2.40 if you already have salt at home. If you do not, the total is $7, which includes a box of kosher salt or coarse sea salt, not table salt, not iodized salt, coarse ground salt with visible grain, a small cloth pouch or leather pouch no larger than your fist and nothing else. Total time, 4 minutes on Friday night before sundown. You open your wallet flat on the table. You take 3 pinches of salt between your right thumb and 2 fingers. 3 pinches, not 2, not 4. The first pinch goes in the upper left corner of the open wallet. The second pinch goes in the upper right corner. The third pinch goes in the lower center. Then you take 1 more pinch, a fourth, smaller pinch, and you place it in the absolute center of the wallet, directly on top of your folded bills. If you carry no cash, place the salt on top of your primary card. The merchants on Hester Street always placed it on the paper money, because salt and paper money share a physical property that the rabbis named and modern materials science has since confirmed. Both are hygroscopic. Both absorb and hold environmental conditions. Salt preserves, paper records. Together, according to the Talmudic commentary that these merchants carried in their heads without needing to open a book, they form a closed system. Now you fold your money over the salt. You close the wallet. You hold it between both palms for 30 seconds. And you say, not to the room, not to anyone listening, but into your own chest, the way you would say something you mean completely. You say, what I have preserved, I hold. What I hold, I multiply. What I multiply, I covenant. You do not need to say it in Hebrew. The merchants on Eldridge Street said it in Yiddish. The intention is the operative element, not the language. The salt is already doing its work. Then you place the wallet in the small cloth pouch. You leave it there for the duration of Friday night until Saturday after sundown. When you remove it Saturday night, you brush the salt away from the bills without discarding it. You return the salt to the earth, which means you take it outside and release it, even into a planter, even into a crack in the sidewalk. The earth receives it. That completes the cycle. You do this every Friday, not most Fridays, every Friday. The Eldridge Street ledger shows 28 years of unbroken weekly notation. The consistency was the practice. The merchants who maintained it without interruption were the ones whose wealth held across the 1907 panic, across the 1913 banking reforms, across the Depression. The ones who stopped because they got busy, because they felt embarrassed, because they had opened a bank account and thought they did not need the old way anymore. Those are the ones whose households lost ground. Total time, 4 minutes. Total cost, $2.40. Total commitment, every Friday night before the sun goes down. His name was Reuven. He was born in Vilna in 1888. His father had been a salt merchant, not a metaphor, an actual salt merchant, one of the families that controlled the trade routes between Minsk and Berdikiv before the Russian military disrupted them in 1903. Reuven arrived at Ellis Island in June of 1906. The immigration record shows he declared $4 in his possession. He listed his occupation as dry goods. He had an address in Brooklyn waiting for him, a cousin on Marcy Avenue in Williamsburg. By 1910, he was working out of a stall on Orchard Street. By 1916, he had moved his operation to a storefront on Essex. By 1924, the Lower East Side Tzedakah ledgers, the charity contribution records that the synagogue maintained publicly, because transparency in charity was considered a mark of integrity, show his household contributing $3,200 a year. That is the equivalent of $58,000 today. He arrived with $4. He was contributing $3,200 annually within 18 years. And he never held a bank account until 1931, when federal pressure made it effectively mandatory. Reuven died in 1962. His grandson, who now lives in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, sent me the original leather pouch last September. Not a copy, the original. It still has salt residue inside it. He included a handwritten note that said, "My grandfather kept two things his whole life. This pouch and one sentence he said every Friday. He said, 'The covenant does not expire, the institution does.'" I have that note. I have read it with my own eyes, and the moment I read it was the moment I understood that what I had been researching for 3 years was not a superstition or a folk practice. It was a technology, a financial technology so durable that it survived 2 world wars, the Depression, and the systematic dismantling of the immigrant informal economy. It survived because it required nothing from any institution to function. Everything I have covered across this channel, the salt, the coins, the Friday night system, the Hebrew letters, the Manhattan Ledger method, is now compiled in one place. It is called the Eliezer Wealth Archive. The link is in the description. But stay here, because what I am about to tell you next is the part that kept me up writing this script at 3 in the morning. In 1907, J.P. Morgan decided you would never learn this. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act built the architecture that replaced it. In 1933, Glass-Steagall and the FDIC completed the absorption of informal merchant wealth into institutional control. In 1971, the IRS changed a single regulation governing the recording of cash transactions that effectively criminalized the scale of informal commerce the Lower East Side had operated at for 50 years. 4 events, 4 dates, 1 outcome. The system was buried. But here is what Morgan could not bury. He could not reach into the tallow-lit back rooms on Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg. He could not reach into the Hasidic courts of 1700s Poland, where this practice had been transmitted from rabbi to merchant for 200 years before Manhattan existed as a city. He could not reach back into the Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 1500s, who developed the formal written framework for the Covenant of Salt. He could not reach into the Talmudic academies of Babylonia in the 3rd and 4th centuries, where the Bava Batra commentary on salt as financial protection was first systematized. He could not reach into the ancient Egypt that the Hebrew slaves left carrying only what they could carry in their bodies. He could not reach into Babylon, where the use of salt as a sealing agent in commercial covenants predates written law. 6 civilizations, 4,000 years, a leather pouch, coarse salt, 4 minutes on a Friday night. That is not superstition. That is a transmission that survived every institution that tried to replace it. The rabbis did not lose this. You were just never given it. Now you have it. Tell me in the comments, does your family have a story about a great-grandparent who built something from nothing? Drop the country they came from and one detail you remember. I read every single comment. Hit subscribe, because next week I'm going to open the file on the Williamsburg coin burial practice, the one the Hasidic courts of Brooklyn used from the 1880s through 1933 to protect household wealth from the Federal Reserve's first decade of operation. What I found in those ledgers is a number that does not appear in any history book, not one. A.